Have you thought about dipping your toe into selling vintage clothing online? Or maybe you've already started, but you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the different platforms and shipping and all of the rules and making it a at least somewhat profitable business? Well, I'm here to try and give you a little bit of insight into getting started in the most painless way possible. My name is Laura, and I've been selling vintage online for about 10 years now. I sell on all sorts of platforms like Etsy, eBay, Depop. In the past, I've sold on Poshmark. I also currently sell on Whatnot. And I actually got my start on Instagram, which I will tell you a little bit about. So, in this first video, I'm mostly just going to introduce myself, tell you how I got started, because I think that the way that I learned how to sell is going to be relevant to the things I'm going to talk about later. Um, I want to try and keep this all incredibly simple, but unfortunately, a lot of it isn't. It can be a lot of dense information. I also go off on tangents. You combine those two things and it can get a little crazy. I'm going to try not to let it, but let's just get started with how I began selling vintage. I traditionally was never a thrifter. I didn't even like department stores because it felt too overwhelming with like the amount of choice, and it always felt very disorganized. Like I loved going to just plain old J. Crew, Banana Republic, Anthropology, right? I was not a very adventurous fashion person either. I would get like a really awesome blouse with black pants, black shoes, black jacket. It was very boring that way, I think. Um, when I started dating my boyfriend back in 2011, he was an avid thrifter, and I was definitely not. I was like, ew, gross thrifting. Not even because I thought the clothes were gross, but just it was overwhelming to me going in and just seeing racks and racks and racks of a lot of stuff that maybe I was not interested in, uh, with an occasional thing that maybe was okay. Like it was just a lot for me. But because I'm also a very good little codependent person, while he was spending time in the thrift store doing his thing, I would look through racks just to kind of waste time while I waited for him. So I eventually started finding some cool stuff. And it was just like a top here and there, skirt here and there. Um, when I would shop in a regular store, Anthropology, which was where I was shopping at the time, Anthropology is expensive. And I had a regular corporate job. So when I was buying clothing, I basically wanted to make sure that anything I bought was something I could wear to work because that was where I spent most of my time. And typically, I was only able to purchase one, maybe two items at a time because the shit's expensive. So if you're buying a blouse for $70, you want to make sure you can get the most bang for your buck, right? Um, so thrifting was a very different experience for me. I wasn't getting very creative when I was shopping in regular stores because I couldn't afford to. But when I was thrifting, if there was this tiny little sweater that barely covered my shoulders and was, cropped at my boobs, I wouldn't have bought that in Anthropology for $128. But would I buy it at the thrift store for $4? Yes. Did I need to know how I was going to style it? Not for $4. So I would pick up all sorts of fun little things, and I was building a little wardrobe that I was able to start experimenting with. And a friend of mine started complimenting my outfits and saying, you should write a blog. And I was like, okay. But I did start putting my outfits on Instagram. And this is back in the day when Instagram was like one photo with a bunch of hashtags and some bad filters. And that's what Instagram was. But I was putting my little outfit of the day, OOTD, on Instagram, and using vintage related hashtags. And I started finding other vintage people on there, people who were dressing in vintage, but also people who were selling vintage, and not just clothing, but housewares, kitchenwares, wall, whatever, anything, right? Knickknacks, accessories. And I started just engaging with a lot of the content, as you do when you hyper focus on things. So I started finding little people that I followed regularly. And because I was finding so many cool things at the thrift store, a lot of times you're finding stuff that you don't necessarily want to use for yourself, but you don't want to leave it there. So I would get it, and I started wanting to try to sell some things. It was very intimidating to me, but I had a lot of good models in all of the other Instagram sellers. Now, when you sell on Instagram, what you had to do is you put up a photo of the item with your description, but also you had to deal with shipping pretty much on your own. So you had to know how much to charge for shipping, and you had to be able to give an appropriate quote to a customer. So there was a giant learning curve in there for me, which I think personally was incredibly beneficial for me. I really had to learn the ins and outs of shipping in a way that is harder to do on a lot of other platforms. I think it served me really, really well. And it's a big lesson for me as far as the sort of self-learning that feels tedious but ends up serving you incredibly well down the line. And I'm going to talk about that in a lot of different ways throughout this series. So um, I learned how to protect hard goods well. When you're shipping vintage glassware that has survived 40, 50, 60 years and then gets to you and shatters in the mail because you don't know how to ship things, that is devastating. And also your customers are pissed off. So I learned all of this stuff through my Instagram selling. Now I think that selling on Instagram has become more difficult nowadays with reels and carousel posts and all of that stuff, although the carousel posts are more useful. But Instagram is becoming much more of a video driven platform, much like TikTok is. And it does make it a little bit more challenging if you're not good at putting out super engaging type of reels content. I think it can be challenging. Also, I think that the community on Instagram is so much larger, and the way that the algorithm works, favoring reels and things like that, I think it is harder to build your audience on Instagram, right? I have a following on Instagram of like 4,000 people. And when I post anything, I almost never am able to successfully sell anything through Instagram anymore, but also I don't try that hard. It's discouraging for me. So I think it was a really great learning experience, but I think it's quite difficult to jump into now. Another thing that really, really worked well for me was that when I started selling vintage online, I was doing it for fun. I was not trying to do it as a business. I was doing it because I was finding all this cool stuff that I wanted to share with other people, but I had a regular job on the side. When I first started selling on real platforms, I think Etsy was the first place I listed anything. I was terrified to list on Etsy because to me, especially at that time, it was before all the big, print on demand and China resellers all infiltrated and ruined Etsy. It was fancy vintage sellers, in my opinion, and it was very intimidating to me. Um, I started off my Etsy shop with high ticket, high demand items that I happened to find at a thrift store. The first thing I sold on Etsy was a Catherine Holm teapot. I think it sold for like $215 or something. It was in gorgeous condition. I think the second thing that I sold or listed was a Pyrex bowl set, the balloons set. If you're not familiar with this stuff, that's okay. But they're just very coveted pieces that people are specifically looking for. And that was working in my benefit. I had no reviews. I had no history on Etsy as a seller. So people didn't really have a reason to trust me. Also, at the time, you were only able to use 5 photos on Etsy. So I figured that by using a very in-demand item that I knew people would specifically search for, they weren't coming to my shop for me, they were coming to my shop for that item. I tried to be as like crazy descriptive as I could, mentioning any tiny little anything flaw-wise. And I priced things a little bit lower than what the sort of going rate was because I wanted it to be enticing. I wanted people to feel okay taking a risk with me. And I think that worked in my favor. So it was a very slow build. And I think that's something that a lot of reseller educational videos don't talk about. It's always like how to make $100,000 in 30 days. By the way, I don't think that that's super true. It's definitely not true for me. So, I think that's going to be a big part of my message is this is not a fast road. This is a very slow and intentional build. You need to have patience to get into doing this. And I do think it's best if you're able to start it off as a hobby or a supplement to something that you're already doing for income. But, I think you can make it work otherwise? Yes, but I think that the bumps in the road are going to hit a lot harder. So that was kind of my first little learning experience. And then through Instagram and eventually like a Facebook group, I joined a very small Facebook group of other vintage and handmade sellers. That group was so instrumental to me in my early days of learning. But I also joined a whole bunch of big Facebook groups as well. And I will also say that the really big Facebook groups gave me different information. Sometimes it was learning about shipping, learning about changes in eBay's, policies, etc. Sometimes though it was also just about seeing how negative and awful other sellers could be, which helped me understand a lot better when customers were coming at me with sort of more anger than a situation may have warranted. It helped me understand. It helped me understand a lot about the way that customers interact with sellers, and it also gave me a lot of insight into how not to engage with customers. Um, Not that I would have engaged with customers the way that a lot of these sellers do. Some of them are scary. I'm going to put that out there. There's some incredibly entitled and scary sellers in the reselling world. Um, I I don't want to say that I think that the customer is always right, but I do think it's really important to look at every situation and say, how can I look at this with an assumption that maybe the customer is right and sort of work from there. And I'll talk about some of that as well. But that's just my little introductory video. So I think that the next video that I'm going to do in this series is going to talk about figuring out what types of items that you would like to sell. And that may be a very easy thing for you to figure out, but it may also be a little bit more challenging. And I'll explain some of the reasons why I think certain things are more challenging to sell than others. So thank you so much for watching this. I hope it was helpful, and I will see you again soon.